Hello everyone, this is Anita, and I've wanted to do this video for a long time. I've had a really difficult time trying to figure out exactly how I wanted to do it. So I think I've got an idea, and hopefully you'll find this helpful. And it dawned on me a while ago that in the first two videos in this little series on theology, that I had talked about if your theology causes you problems, to change your theology. And it dawned on me that I really should talk a little bit about how you go about changing your theology, because it's not just anything goes. You really need to be responsible for how you address your relationship with God, how you conceive of God, which is what theology is. And there's some guidelines that I have found useful, and I thought I'd pass those guidelines along to you in hopes that maybe you'd find this as useful as well. This certainly isn't the only way to go about it, but it speaks to the type of things that need to be done in order to be honest in terms of coming up with a theology. It's not the easiest thing in the world to do. And the first thing I'd like to do, this is going to be, I'm sure, somewhat controversial for people who are more of a fundamentalist or a conservative Christian background, or conservative any background. But one of the first things I'd like to point out, and again, this is going to be sort of Christian based, because that's what I know, that's who I am, and that's what I know. But the first thing is to pay attention to science. That your religion and science should not be at odds with one another. And I know that that's kind of not in the mainstream Christian experience at this point. But the Bible, first thing in the Bible does is tells us that God creates the universe. God creates everything that is. And so if God is creating this, science is starting to tell us something about God, not the type of things that God thought were important enough for God to do. And so I think what you need to do is really be aware of science, this concept that creation wasn't a one-time event, that things are being created now, there are processes for creating things, and that God somehow is a God of process. I've talked about process theology, which looks at God as a process. You don't really have to go quite that far, but to realize that God is actually a God that creates open-ended processes. And that's really what science is telling us. Science is telling us that there's some fuzziness, that God didn't really make everything deterministic. And again, this kind of goes against the current Christian orthodoxy, which has a God that's in charge of everything. But the Bible doesn't necessarily show that. And I'll talk about that in just a minute. But it's important to look at science and take some lessons from science in terms of how you approach God and how you conceive of God. And if those two things are not at odds with one another, then one of the things you don't prey to with your theology is having science undermine it. And the two are really completely separate. Science cannot prove God or disprove God, and your theology, though, can help you integrate with science and find, through science, a way of feeling closer to God and approaching God. Now, the second major guideline, and I haven't broken these down into some nice organized structure, so you're going to get what you get, is to really be attentive to the scripture. Not just this passage over here or this passage over here, but to be able to read large chunks of the scripture, if not all of it, and look at themes that get developed through various parts of the Bible. And in particular, to be attentive to how the Bible addresses God, what the view of God that's inherent in the scripture is. And I was thinking about this in terms of how I wanted to present this. And one of the things that struck me is that you could do an overview of the different views of God in the Bible. And there are a lot of different views. There's not one view of God. There isn't a fixed theology in the Bible. And it's important to realize that. And it's important to be attentive to what is the theology that's being presented for any particular given scripture. For example, the very first part of the Bible opens up, and God is a transcendent creator. But by the time you get to the second chapter in the book of Genesis, God is walking through the garden in a very human way and having to call out to the human because apparently God doesn't know where the human is, because the human is hiding from him. So we go from a God that's transcendent to a God that's very immanent, a God that's very present. We go from a God who punishes and turns away. When Israel goes astray, God walks away from Israel, sort of washes God's hand of them, but at the same time turns around and wants to be reunited with his chosen people. You see God as a giver of law and someone who demands complete commitment to that law. You can't, there's terrible punishment if you violate the laws of God. And yet we also have the story of Joshua going into the Holy Land, into the Promised Land. Sorry, not the Holy Land, it's that too, but still at this time Promised Land. And being given the land and told not to save the lives of any of the people still there. And yet Rahab, and then later the Gideonites, both are brought into the Israel community, or the Hebrew community, in violation of God's commandment. And you don't see God doing anything to them for that. So you have, in the Torah, you get this real sense of a God that is concerned about purity, is concerned about sacrifice, is concerned about the body as a whole, that the individual can contaminate the whole body. So often, if a person does something wrong, or is somehow contaminated, then the whole body is contaminated, and you see these punishments against the whole people. Certainly as we progress through and we get into the reign of the kings, and by the time we get to Jesus, that image of God has changed quite a bit. You have God who is now the Father, who takes the king as his son, and looks at the king as long as the king does what God commands, as his favored son, and is graceful and protective. At the same time, if the king does something bad, then you have God essentially overthrowing the king or raising up somebody else. And so you see these a God that is actually played out much more at the level of a nation as opposed to individual morality. Certainly by the time you get to Jesus, you have a very different image of God, where you have an image of God who comes into life, who comes in to take on the vulnerabilities, the difficulties of human life, who goes to the cross in order to reconcile the people to him, to God. Sorry for the pronoun. And it is important to understand how this whole theology has sort of morphed through the course of the Bible. I think that's a little beyond where I am, but to be aware that it does, that there isn't a single theology here, that the God that teaches through Jesus for us to love our enemies is the God that in Joshua is telling the people to destroy everybody in the land. So pay attention to those two themes. And then there's the last one I'd say is, because I'm Christian, I use Jesus really as kind of the cornerstone, if you will, where you actually measure yourself. You use it as the comparison of everything else, and you look at what his teachings are and see how they match up with what your theology is. Is your theology in line with it, or is it at odds with it? And or is your theology in line with his actions? Not just his teachings, but his actions as well. How he actually performed, the things that he actually did. And so there's some things there that, from a transgender perspective, are useful. First of all, this is a part of the lesson that I'm preparing right now for Sunday school tomorrow, because this is a Saturday. That Jesus sends the disciples in to find a place for the Passover meal, the upper room, and they are to follow a man carrying a jar of water. Well, in the culture of that day, men didn't carry water in jars, men carried water in skins. And so a man carrying water in a jar would be acting in a non-gender conforming way. It's probably wrong to talk about the person as transgender, but it's quite possible that the person sees themselves as being gender non-conforming, and that's whose house they go to for the Last Supper. The other thing is stay with the Gospel of Mark, because that's what I've been teaching. There is a passage in chapter 10 that 11, chapter 12. That is a conversation with the scribe about what is the greatest commandment. And Jesus says, oh, there's two. And he quotes the Shema, Hear, O Israel, the Lord is your God, the Lord is one. And then the second one is to love your neighbor as yourself. Which raises an interesting question, which is, how do you love your neighbor as yourself if you don't love yourself? And as a transgender woman, I have to accept myself as a woman, in spite of what my body screams at me, in order to actually be myself, to have any chance of actually loving myself. And in terms of God, of being able to love God with all my heart, with all my soul, with all my mind, with all my strength, those things require that I be who I am. And that is transgender. The second thing is that there's another passage that's often used to sort of bang transgender people over the head, or gay and lesbian, bisexual, the whole alternative gender, alternative sexuality community, by saying, oh, you have to pick up your cross and follow Jesus, and they interpret picking up your cross as maybe acknowledging that you are a member of this community, but then denying yourself to do anything about it. Don't live that way, don't transition, don't express yourself, don't be yourself, is really what they're telling you. And they say it's your cross to bear. How does that match up with loving yourself? And this is the the last thing I really want to address is you really have to wrestle with this. You really have to look at, well, there are these passages that have been used, but is there a way of saying, no, that's not really the right interpretation. We have to look at changing that interpretation, changing what's said, and you look at the larger context that falls into. And I think it becomes clear that there's still this effort to be, you have to be who you are. As a transgender woman who's a Christian, I have started looking at as my cross to bear being transgender, but it is to be, to bear the cross means to express myself in the face of any hate, in the face of any violence, in the face of any discomfort, as a way of saying we are here, we are who we are, and that it causes a transgender, especially a white male, who has all the privilege in the world, becoming transgender, embracing being transgender, embracing being a woman. Those things take away almost all, not all, but almost all of that privilege. And you're entering into life as one of the ones who becomes vulnerable. And I believe if we look at God coming into humanity and becoming vulnerable, then God is calling for us to become vulnerable to one another, to be ourselves, to stand up for ourselves, to confront other people as ourselves, and realize that we share in a vulnerability that many times is uncomfortable, but that's really what the cross is. The cross is making yourself vulnerable to other people, and the only way to do that as a transgender person is for me to be me. So I wanted to stop there, so this doesn't go on, and I didn't ramble too much, I don't think. But I wanted to stop there and say this is how I struggled with coming up with a new theology that worked better for me as a transgender woman. I was already a long ways down this path beforehand. In some ways, I think that the theology I'd come up with helped in this transition. But I will, in the description below, link some authors that I think would be useful to read that will give you a different perspective and are biblically aware enough that they'll actually talk to the scriptural side of things. But anyway, I do hope you find this interesting. I hope this has been helpful. Again, please subscribe, clicking on the beautiful person who shows up, I think, on this side. And because I don't post on a regular basis, but I really want you to feel comfortable with changing your theology if the theology has gotten in your way and won't let you be who you are and still have a relationship with God as a Christian or as anything else. So thank you very much for watching, and goodbye.